I returned on the day of my funeral. The taxi dropped me at the curb, and through the living room window I could see my own photograph draped in black ribbon, positioned next to an empty coffin that bore my name. 23 people had gathered to mourn me, including my wife Sarah, who wore the black dress I'd bought her for our anniversary, and my best friend Marcus, whose hand rested protectively on her shoulder in a way that made my stomach turn to lead. My name is James Michael Sullivan, and at 34 I shouldn't have been watching my own memorial service from the sidewalk like some ghost haunting his former life. I'd spent 18 months in Afghanistan, attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, surviving IED blasts and firefights in the mountains near Kandahar. I'd made it through all of that, only to discover that the Army had declared me dead 3 weeks ago due to what they'd later call administrative error, a bureaucratic phrase that couldn't begin to capture the devastation of standing outside your own funeral. The flag ceremony was just beginning as I approached the front door. Through the window, I watched the honor guard members fold the stars and stripes with practiced precision, each crease sharp and deliberate. Sarah accepted the triangle of fabric with trembling hands, pressing it against her chest as tears streamed down her face. Marcus stepped closer, his arm encircling her waist, and I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with mortar shells or enemy fire. I turned the key, the same key I'd carried through 3 deployments, worn smooth by nervous fingers during countless patrols. The lock clicked, and I stepped into what had been my home but now felt like a museum dedicated to my memory. The room fell silent except for the soft sob escaping from Sarah's throat. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Rodriguez, my old squad leader, who stood near the mantel where my bronze star was displayed. His face had gone white as chalk. "Jimmy?" Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto mine with an expression I'd never seen before, not relief, not joy, but something closer to terror. The folded flag slipped from her hands and fell to the carpet. Marcus took a step backward, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and what I recognized as guilt. "Hello, Sarah," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the sudden silence. "I'm sorry I'm late." The next few minutes passed in a blur of gasps, half-formed explanations, and the kind of chaos that follows when the impossible becomes real. My mother rushed forward first, her arms wrapping around me with a strength that surprised us both. My father stood frozen, as if I might disappear if he moved too quickly. Sarah remained rooted in place, staring at me like I was an apparition that might vanish if she blinked. "They said you were killed," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of confused voices. "An IED in Helmand Province. They had witnesses, Jimmy. They had witnesses who saw you die." I nodded slowly, understanding now why my emails had gone unanswered, why my calls home had been met with disconnected numbers. "The IED was real," I said, "but it got Phillips, not me. Blew him to pieces while I was 20 yards away. Must have gotten our dog tags mixed up in the chaos." The memorial guests began to file out, some offering awkward condolences for what I can only describe as my miraculous resurrection. The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes, shook his head in bewilderment as he arranged for the rental items to be picked up the following day. Within an hour the house had emptied except for Sarah, Marcus, and me. We sat in the living room like 3 strangers, the empty coffin still dominating the space between us. Sarah had changed out of her funeral dress into jeans and a sweater I didn't recognize, one of many small changes I was beginning to notice. The coffee table held magazines I'd never seen, books that weren't mine, a man's reading glasses that definitely weren't mine. "I need to explain," Sarah began, but I held up my hand. "No," I said, "I need to understand first. Help me understand what I'm seeing here." Marcus cleared his throat, a sound I remembered from 100 conversations we'd had over beers, back when he was my best friend instead of whatever he was now. "Jim, man, we thought you were dead. The Army was sure. They had a whole investigation." "How long?" I asked, looking directly at Sarah. "How long have you two been together?" She flinched as if I'd struck her. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside I could hear children playing in the neighborhood, where I'd once planned to raise my own kids. The normalcy of their laughter felt obscene against the surreal horror of this conversation. 6 weeks, Sarah said finally. "Marcus has been helping me with everything. The funeral arrangements, the insurance, sorting through your things. It just happened, Jimmy. I was so broken, and he was there, and I thought you were never coming home. I looked at Mark, this man who'd been my best man, who'd been my best man, who'd helped me pick out Sarah's engagement ring, who'd sworn to look after her if anything ever happened to me. I suppose he'd kept that promise, just not in the way any of us had imagined. Where were you going to live? I asked. After you got married. Sarah's face crumpled. We hadn't decided. We were going to wait a year out of respect. Respect for who? I was dead, remember? The words came out harder than I'd intended, edged with a bitterness that surprised me. In Afghanistan, I'd imagined coming home to Sarah's arms, to quiet dinners and long conversations about everything I'd seen and done. I'd never imagined this feeling like an intruder in my own life, watching my wife plan a future that didn't include me with a man who knew exactly how I liked my coffee, and which side of the bed I slept on. Marcus stood up abruptly. I should go, he said. Let you two figure this out. Sit down, I said, and something in my voice made him comply immediately. You're part of this now. We're all part of this. I studied them both. Sarah, who'd lost weight and gained worry lines around her eyes, and Marcus, who couldn't quite meet my gaze. These were the two people I'd loved most in the world, and now I didn't know what they were to me, or what I was to them. Tell me about the funeral, I said. Tell me what you said about me. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. I talked about how much you loved this house, how you were always fixing something or planning some project. I told them about the garden you planted before you left, how the tomatoes came up even though I forgot to water them for weeks. I remembered that garden. I'd spent my last weekend home digging and planting, believing in a future where I'd return to harvest what I'd sown. What else? Marcus spoke about your time in the service, Sarah continued, about how proud you were to serve, how you always said you were fighting for something bigger than yourself. I looked at Marcus. Is that what you said? That I was proud? He nodded, still unable to meet my eyes. I talked about Kandahar, about the kids you helped at that school, about how you always sent half your pay home, and never complained about anything, even when you had every right to. The memories came flooding back. The school where we delivered supplies, the faces of children who'd never seen chocolate before, the feeling that maybe we were making a difference in all that chaos and violence. I'd held on to those moments during the worst times, when the heat was unbearable, and the mortars fell like deadly rain. I was proud, I said quietly. I was proud, and I was scared, and I was homesick every single day. But I never imagined coming home to this. We sat in silence as darkness fell outside. Sarah made coffee, moving around the kitchen with the careful efficiency of someone trying to maintain normalcy in an impossible situation. I noticed she still took her coffee black, still tapped the spoon 3 times against the cup rim before setting it aside. Some things at least remained unchanged. I dreamed about you, Sarah said suddenly, setting a mug in front of me. After they told me you were dead, I dreamed you came home, and everything was normal, like nothing had happened. Then I'd wake up and remember all over again. What did you do with my things? I asked. They're in the garage, Marcus said. Your uniforms, your books, the model planes you were building. Sarah couldn't bear to give them away, but she couldn't stand to look at them either. I nodded, understanding. In Afghanistan we'd called it ghost gear, the personal effects of soldiers who didn't make it home. It always felt wrong to handle another man's private things, but someone had to pack them up, ship them back to families who didn't know what to do with the remnants of a life cut short. I want to see them, I said. The garage had been transformed into a storage area, my belongings packed in labeled boxes with the kind of careful organization Sarah used when she was trying not to think too hard about what she was doing. I opened the first box and found my dress uniform, the one I'd planned to wear to weddings and funerals and formal occasions that would never come. The fabric still smelled faintly of the cologne I'd worn on our last night together before deployment. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching me rifle through the pieces of my former life. I kept everything, she said, even the things that didn't make sense to keep. Your toothbrush, your coffee mug, that stupid hat you wore when you worked in the yard. I found the hat in question, a faded baseball cap with a beer logo that had been my weekend uniform for years. Putting it on felt like putting on an old skin that no longer quite fit. Sarah, I said, not turning around, do you love him? The question hung in the air between us. I could hear her breathing, could feel her struggle to find words for something that probably couldn't be explained in words. I thought I was going to die from missing you, she said finally. After they told me, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I lost 12 pounds in 2 weeks. Marcus came by to check on me, and then he just kept coming by. He was the only person who understood what we'd lost, because he loved you too. I turned to face her. That's not what I asked. She met my eyes for the first time since I'd walked through the door. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know anything anymore. Over the following days, we tried to establish some kind of routine, some way of coexisting in the space between my death and resurrection. Marcus stayed away, which was probably wise but also felt like cowardice. Sarah and I moved around each other like polite strangers, careful not to touch, careful not to say the wrong thing, careful not to acknowledge the fundamental wrongness of our situation. The army sent a representative, a young captain who looked barely old enough to vote, let alone handle the bureaucratic nightmare of unkilling a soldier. He explained the chain of errors that had led to my premature death certificate, a mix-up at the field hospital, incorrectly filed paperwork, a failure of communication between units. It was, he assured me, extremely rare. Rare, I repeated, like getting struck by lightning. Actually, sir, statistically speaking, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than to have this particular administrative error occur. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I'd survived 18 months in one of the most dangerous places on earth, only to be killed by paperwork and resurrected by bureaucracy. The hardest part wasn't the practical aspects, reactivating bank accounts, reclaiming my identity, explaining to employers and friends that reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated. The hardest part was the way Sarah looked at me, like she was seeing a ghost that refused to stay dead. We slept in the same bed, but on opposite edges, careful not to let our bodies touch in the darkness. We made small talk over breakfast, and watched television in the evenings, two people playing house in a home that no longer felt like home to either of us. One evening, about a week after my return, I found Sarah crying over a photo album in the living room. The pictures showed her and Marcus at various gatherings, a barbecue at his house, a charity event at the VFW, a hiking trip to the mountains. In every photo, she was smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before my deployment. "You look happy," I said, sitting down beside her on the couch. She closed the album quickly, as if hiding evidence of a crime. I was trying to move on. Everyone said I had to move on. Maybe you should. She looked at me sharply. What does that mean? I stared at the blank television screen, seeing my reflection wavering like a mirage. Maybe some things can't be unbroken. Maybe some deaths can't be undied. Don't say that. Why not? It's true, isn't it? The man you fell in love with, the man you married, he did die over there. Maybe not the way the army thought, but he died just the same. I'm not the same person who left here 2 years ago, Sarah. You're not the same person either. Maybe we need to stop pretending we can go back to who we were. She was quiet for a long time, turning her wedding ring around and around on her finger. It was a gesture I remembered from our worst fights, back when our biggest problems were money and career decisions, and whether to start a family. What are you saying? She asked finally. I'm saying maybe we need to figure out who we are now, instead of trying to resurrect who we used to be. That night, for the first time since my return, we talked, really talked, without the careful politeness that had characterized our interactions. Sarah told me about the depression that had followed my supposed death, about the night she'd considered following me into whatever darkness I'd entered. She told me about Marcus's patience, his refusal to take advantage of her grief, the way he'd held her while she cried without asking for anything in return. I told her about Afghanistan, not the sanitized version I'd shared in letters and phone calls, but the real story. The morning we'd lost Jenkins to a sniper, the night I'd held a dying Afghan boy while his mother screamed in a language I didn't understand, the dreams that still woke me in cold sweats. I told her about the guilt I carried for surviving when better men didn't, about the way violence had changed something fundamental in my wiring. I keep waiting to feel angry, I said, about you and Marcus. I should be furious, right? I should want to kill him or at least hate him, but I just feel empty, like all the anger got used up over there. Sarah curled up against my side, the first voluntary physical contact we'd had since my return. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Jimmy. Don't be sorry for grieving me, I said. Don't be sorry for trying to find happiness after they told you I was dead. Be sorry that we don't know how to find our way back to each other. We held each other in the darkness, two survivors of different wars trying to find common ground in the ruins of what we'd once shared. It wasn't love exactly, but it wasn't not love either. It was something more complicated, more honest than the simple emotions we'd known before. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later during a conversation with Marcus that I'd been dreading since my return. He'd asked to meet at the diner where we used to go for coffee when we were younger men with simpler problems. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the month since my resurrection, his face gaunt and his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. "I need you to know," he said without preamble, "that I never meant for this to happen. I was trying to take care of her like you asked me to, and somewhere along the way I fell in love with her. Not with your widow, with her, with Sarah. And I know that makes me the worst kind of friend, but I can't pretend it isn't true." I stirred sugar into my coffee, buying time to think. In Afghanistan we'd had a saying, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." I was beginning to understand that no relationship survives contact with reality unchanged. "Are you happy with her?" I asked. The question seemed to surprise him. "What? When you're with Sarah, are you happy? Does she make you laugh? Do you look forward to seeing her at the end of the day?" Marcus stared at me like I'd asked him to explain quantum physics. "Jesus, Jim, yes, yes, she makes me happy, but you're her husband." "I'm her dead husband who came back to life," I corrected. "That's not the same thing as being her husband." We sat in silence, 2 men trying to navigate emotional territory that had no maps or guidebooks. Outside the diner window, ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, unaware that resurrection was more complicated than the movies made it seem. "I love her," Marcus said finally. "I love her, and I think she might love me, and I don't know what to do with that." "Have you asked her?" "Asked her what?" "If she loves you." He shook his head.
How can I?
"You're back. Everything's changed." I leaned back in the booth, studying this man who'd been my closest friend for over a decade. "Maybe that's the problem," I said.
How can... Maybe we're all so focused on what was that we can't see what is.
That evening I sat Sarah down in our living room and told her what I'd been thinking about for weeks. I told her that the man she'd married had died in Afghanistan, not in body but in spirit. That the man who'd come home was someone new, someone she didn't know and might not love if she got to know him. I told her that I'd seen enough death to understand that some endings are actually beginnings, and that maybe what we were facing wasn't the end of our marriage,
but the birth of something different.
"I release you," I said, the words feeling strange and formal in my mouth, "from whatever vows we made to people who don't exist anymore. I release you to choose what you want your life to look like, not what you think it should look like." Sarah cried then, not the silent tears she'd been shedding since my return, but deep body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd kept locked away. I held her while she cried, and for the first time since I'd walked through our front door, it felt right.
What about you?
She asked when the tears had subsided. "What do you choose?" I thought about the question seriously, considering options I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. "I choose to find out who I am now," I said. "I choose to stop trying to be a ghost of who I used to be." The divorce papers were finalized on a Tuesday in October, almost 6 months after my return from the dead. Sarah and Marcus were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the same church where she and I had been married 8 years earlier. I stood as Marcus's best man, which probably seemed strange to the other guests but felt right to the three of us. Sarah was radiant in a simple blue dress, her face lit with a happiness that I remembered from our early days together, but which had been absent during our final months as husband and wife. Marcus looked nervous and proud and grateful in the way of a man who knows he's been given an unexpected gift. During their vows, they promised to love each other through whatever administrative errors life might throw their way, which made all three of us laugh, despite the tears. I bought a small house across town, close enough to maintain the friendships we'd rebuilt from the wreckage of our former lives but far enough away to give everyone space to breathe. I started seeing a therapist, a Vietnam veteran, who understood something about coming home from war to find that home wasn't what you'd left behind. I got a dog, a German Shepherd mix named Phoenix, who didn't care about my past or my mistakes, only about walks and tennis balls and the simple pleasure of human company. Slowly, carefully, I began to build a life that belonged to the person I'd become rather than the person I'd been. I took a job with a local veterans organization, helping other returned soldiers navigate the complex process of reintegration. I discovered that my experience, both with war and with resurrection, gave me a unique perspective on the challenges of coming home. One evening, about a year after the divorce, I was working in my garden when Sarah stopped by. She was visibly pregnant, glowing with the particular radiance of expectant mothers. We sat on my back porch, drinking iced tea, and watching Phoenix chase butterflies with determined futility. "Are you happy?" she asked, echoing the question I'd once asked Marcus. I considered the question carefully. Happy seemed too simple for what I felt, a complex mixture of peace, purpose, and possibility that I hadn't experienced since before my first deployment. "I'm content," I said finally. "I'm becoming who I'm supposed to be instead of trying to be who I was." "I used to worry that we were being selfish," Sarah said. "That we were abandoning you after everything you'd been through." "You didn't abandon me," I said. "You saved me, all of us. We just couldn't see it at the time." She reached over and took my hand, a gesture that would have been complicated a year earlier, but now felt simple and right. "Thank you," she said, "for letting us find our way. Thank you for showing me that some resurrections are actually births." As evening fell and Sarah headed home to Marcus and their growing family, I sat on my porch with Phoenix at my feet and reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. I thought about the young soldier I'd been, so certain that life was a straight line from point A to point B, and about the man I'd become, who understood that the most important journeys are the ones that take you places you never planned to go. In Afghanistan, I'd learned that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about finding meaning in the aftermath of trauma, purpose in the wake of loss. Coming home to my own funeral had taught me that resurrection isn't about returning to what was, but about having the courage to embrace what is and what might be. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and steady above the horizon. I made a wish on it, not for the past to return or the future to unfold in any particular way, but for the wisdom to recognize grace when it appears in unexpected forms. Sometimes the best thing about dying, I realized, is discovering what it means to truly live. Phoenix nudged my hand with his wet nose, reminding me that there were still simple pleasures to be enjoyed. A dog's unconditional love, the satisfaction of a day's work well done, the quiet contentment of a man who has found his place in the world not by returning to where he started, but by having the courage to begin again. I was James Michael Sullivan, a man who had died and been reborn not once but twice, once in the mountains of Afghanistan, and once in the living room of his former home. I was a veteran, a friend, a gardener, and a man still discovering who he might become. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like more than enough.